Estamos en la entrevista educativa que hacemos en Educar Chile para intentar siempre discutir y conversar con personalidades del mundo de la educación, del mundo internacional de la educación que visitan Chile, y tenemos aquí la oportunidad de profundizar con ellos aspectos relevantes del pensamiento educativo contemporáneo. En este caso tenemos un invitado muy interesante. Se trata del profesor Levin, economista de la educación de la Universidad de Columbia, que ha hecho muchísimos estudios en distintos dominios de la educación, incluye la privatización de la enseñanza, que va a ser un tema muy importante hoy día, y que tiene una particularidad, que no solo ha sido un economista de escritorio de universidad, sino que adicionalmente a eso ha sido una persona involucrada en mejorar específicamente las escuelas en Norteamérica, y para eso ha hecho un movimiento muy interesante que se llama de las escuelas aceleradas, de Accelerated Schools, que ha aprendido y ha tenido mucha vigencia. De eso vamos a hablar hoy día con Levin. How are you, Hervin?
Very good, thank you.
Well, maybe the first question can be all this aspect of privatization that you have developed and have researched. What is, in your view, the causes that not only in Chile, which has been sure a pioneer on that, but in other countries on the world, we have this movement to privatization. What is the insatisfaction that produce this movement, or what is the causes of this movement?
I think that there are probably a few different causes, and some are more important in some countries than in other countries. One is that we often get into conflict over our educational system, how to resolve different issues through education, the curriculum, the particular organization of education, and so at least among some portions of the population, the view is, look, these are all perhaps legitimate differences, but why don't we let people select what they prefer rather than have to get a common solution for everyone. In some of the less developed areas of the world, the public schools are very political. That is, for example, in South Asia, teachers often do not report to the school. They are truant, as we say, and they are protected because they are part of the dominant political party, so there's nothing that one can do about them. And they, in part, do this because they know that the students are not going to get the background to pass the courses. The student families know that they must pay tuition to the teacher, must make payments to the teacher for tutoring to pass the exam. So it's a system that I would use the word corrupt. It's a corrupt system. And in those parts of the world, we are seeing low-fee private schools to try to escape this aspect of the public schools, where the same amount that would be spent on the private tutoring for these very poor families can be put into a low tuition, where the school has teachers every day and where the teachers are supervised, so the students get an education inside of the school. So there are many different situations, and I always emphasize that context is important here.
Yes, it's interesting that you say, because we have in Chile this vision that the privatization is necessarily this privatization that go to the middle class or of the lower class, some
yes.
segments, but it's not the privatization, which is the possibility for the lower class to arrive to the school. That is very different than in our reality.
Yeah, that's a very, very important point, that here in the contrast, in one case you see this for the very, very poor as an alternative to public schools that are not functioning. And in this context, you see this as the alternative for the middle class and maybe upper middle class, as opposed to the lower income groups who are going to public schools.
This is very different. And you think that they have some values in the idea that the private groups can constitute their own schools with the funding of the parents or the funding of the state? They have some important things that can be interesting for the development of an educational system?
Well, In our own work, what we observe are the tensions between different values that are affected by privatization. Now, on the one hand, you know, economists always have on the one hand, on the other, al lado, otro lado. Well, al lado. You are able, by having these kinds of choices, to match the needs of the child and the family more closely to what the school does. When you have just one type of school, you can't do that as readily. But the other side of that is that you now start to separate people and groups in terms of the orientation that they get towards themselves, towards the society, which may not be very productive. I always try to emphasize that when we take a little baby, that baby is not prepared to participate in society, doesn't know anything about the economy, about the proper ways of engaging in conversation, in discourse, understanding one's role or responsibility, civic responsibility, for example, doesn't have a common language. Now, where does all of this come from? Given families with different values, different backgrounds, often even different languages or different versions of the same language, we have a common institution to bring them together. The farther we get from that common institution, the more we may face challenges in the future in terms of separating out groups in society. And we have some very good examples of that where we have seen the consequences, at least in part. Yugoslavia is a good example, because after it was artificially put together at the time of the First World War with all of these provinces and different languages and so on, they decided to maintain different school systems, very different school systems. So this is an extreme case. And ultimately, when serious conflict arose, there wasn't a common bond among the adults in that society. They had all gotten different orientations towards culture, towards religion, towards the polity, the nature of society. They did share a common language, Serbo-Croatian, but that wasn't enough to hold
all these differences
this together, yes, and it was vicious. And
it is possible to think that you, if I understand well, you have the value of the differences, the value of respect this difference, but at the same time this tension with this task of the school, this goal of the school that just is to put together, to create citizenship, to create a common sense, to know the other groups, and to have a place of construction of the processing of the difference. If you can think that, in your view, if you have this kind of private solutions, you must have some kind of restriction in terms that they must accept the diversity?
Well, I think the answer is to think about balance. How do you balance the public good, the public need, the fact that we are one society and either desire to work together or must work together for our own good and for our own future, with respect for some of the individual differences, predilections, orientations. So the question is how you get balance and what balance is. And of course there will be different views on that. So one is that we get balance by having a common curriculum. It turns out that that's important, but it's not sufficient. It's kind of a necessary condition to have at least a major part of the curriculum that addresses the social and political language issues, that part in common. But it's not sufficient, and the reason is that it's done differently in different types of schools. In some cases it's taught by rote, memory, which doesn't change behavior very much. At best, you now hold a package here about what things are supposed to be about, you know. In others, there are actual attempts to create democracy and social involvement, and it's a much more active approach. So we know that that having a curriculum per se, and even having instructional strategies that are supposed to be done, they do not necessarily result in the best solution. But the other problem is a different one, and that is that different kinds of schools, the very appeal that they have to different populations, means that you get different groups in different schools. So some of them get the children from good families. We all know what that means. Others, I choose the local school, the one that's closest. I don't have income for transportation. I want my child to be safe, very close. And so we get very distinct differences in the populations in these schools with their different orientations, with their different backgrounds, and they don't, in a sense, we say, rub up against each other, see each other, understand each other, have discourse with each other. They're separate and separate societies in a sense. So that's a deep concern, and it's a deep concern around the world. It's not just one that we should worry about in Chile, but we're seeing it in the Netherlands, which has had election of schools since 1917, and particularly in those cases as the new immigrants come into the schools.
One important aspect is the selection. When you have these private solutions, the selection of students and the families is a very important point, at least in Chile. We have a big discussion about that.
Yes.
We have changes in the constitution. Now, for example, in the new laws in education, the schools have the possibility to choose the students and the family only in the 7th grade, but not before. But they continue some form of subtleties of selection. What do you think about the selection? Is necessary that these private solutions with the financing of the state accept all the kids?
Well,
this is a democratic requirement?
Right. Again, there is this tension. On the one hand, my child loves the arts. I want to go to a school that emphasizes the arts and that has good art teachers. And that sounds very legitimate. My child will still get the curriculum, will still get all of the other subjects. But schools can also make appeals which are quite different. For example, they can locate in areas where they are not going to get any children from poor backgrounds or immigrant backgrounds or indigenous backgrounds applying. That's a form of selection, even though it's a passive form, or it appears to be passive. We're not actually choosing students. Secondly, schools can discourage families who do apply from actually, making an inscripción, because they explain these are our expectations, the family will do this, the family will do that, and that's generally permitted, and that tells families that don't have the capacity to do those things that perhaps this isn't going to be a good school for their child. There are a variety of ways that schools discourage students, and that can have a pretty powerful effect, because no parent wants the child in a school where the child's going to be very uncomfortable. So that they're not very welcoming to certain kinds of students. And then a lot of this is self-selection. It's based on self-selection. In Chile, my understanding is that the distance to the school is very important for the poor. But it's not for the middle class. They can manage to figure out ways to get transport if they really want their child in a certain school. So those are very different motives. So that's the problem. In other words, even when you pass laws, and they can be helpful, I wouldn't discourage that, there are a variety of ways. When we tell schools compete in the marketplace, they're going to use their own objectives to do that, and they're not ones that can always be contained by laws.
We have another fact that is very important in Chile, which is the shared financement of the families. That is a common situation in the world, that you have the financement for this private solution, you have the financement of the state, and you can add a private financement of the families.
I would say in European systems where they have election of schools, that's not typical. That is typically it's the finance from the government. If you are going to participate, now there are schools, as in Chile, where the only finance, the very, very expensive schools, the only finance comes from the family. But in Holland, for example, there's an equivalent amount for every student at a particular grade level with particular needs, and schools are not permitted to charge more than that.
Yes, because this is one, for example, in Chile, in the debate, this is one of the causes of the segregation, that the possibility of the school to change the social structure. Yes. Is restricted. Yeah. If you have this kind of solution that mix, and that is so clear that if you can pay, you can go to some kind of a school or not.
Yeah, and this is the tension again between, in a sense, democratic and government-operated schools and the marketplace. Because in the marketplace, people with more income can get a better automobile or can go to an expensive restaurant. And of course, if you're constrained by your income, you probably don't have an automobile. You're dependent upon public transportation, and you do the best you can to feed your family.
Finally, maybe a last question about privatization that can be interesting for us is in terms of innovation and the possibility of innovate really with all these constraints that we have of the standards and the final form of measurement and so on. Do they have a good context for innovation in the private or in the public schools now?
Well, let me give you a surprising answer for that. And that is, many parents, maybe most of them, don't want innovation. Their view of education is perhaps what they went through, or this vision that children need discipline, it's the subjects, yes, there are so-called, let's call them avant-garde parents who have a vision of a school that's quite different. But one of the big surprises we found in the US with our charter schools, these were supposed to be highly innovative and then provide lessons for the regular public schools. And what we found is a very significant number became much more traditional. And the reason is that many parents who prefer an alternative to the public schools want something more conservative, more traditional. They see the public schools as being too innovative. And this of course was a big surprise to us, but in the marketplace, parents are supposed to select the school that matches up to their values, what they see as the needs of their child. And there are a lot of parents who think that, for example, the use of the video and the internet and methods of inquiry with students and Socratic techniques and all of these things are inappropriate. They're not the education they want their child to get. They want their child to memorize material, to repeat it back, to be disciplined, to be responsive to authority. And that's a different kind of school, and not innovative, but historical.
That is surprising. Well, thank you, Henry Levin, for this conversation about privatization. And maybe the last question that we ask of always our guests in this space: what is, if you can to give one only advice to our Chilean education, what will be your advice?
Well, my advice would be to be concerned about the stratification of students, particularly by income, in different schools where they don't get together, where they don't interact, where they don't see each other, where they get stereotypic images of each other, and those kinds of things are not only destructive in themselves, but we also lose something. And what we lose is the ability of students to learn from each other. There are peer effects, and we see it, for example, in the PISA data. We see that what we do is we control statistically for the social class of the student when we look at the test scores in PISA. But we find that beyond that, the social class of the school makes a big difference in terms of what students learn and how well they do. And we really need to enlist that in the education of students, even beyond the importance of this kind of exposure of students for democratic reasons and for social cohesion reasons in our society. So this is something that's very difficult to accomplish, but I think we can do much more to prevent the stratification.
Thank you, Professor Levin, for this possibility of this dialogue.
Okay, it's my pleasure.